Welcome to Acclime Conversations, where we talk to the business people that matter in Vietnam and learn a bit behind of what makes them successful. Today we're talking to Daan van Rossum, who's the CEO at Dreamplex. Daan, welcome very much.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
It's sort of an exciting time because you've got a few interesting changes that in work life, in flex space, there's a whole lot of things that I want to explore and learn a bit about. Before I talk about that, and before we learn about your journey to Dreamplex, or what it is and the evolution of a flexible workspace, I want to learn a bit about your background. I want to find out about why you came here. So you've been Chicago, New York, Singapore, Amsterdam, Ho Chi Minh City. I think I've missed one in there as well. It's a bit of a journey to get where you are. Tell us the story and tell us how you came here.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks again for having me. That sounds like a really long journey, and that's probably because I'm getting older now. But my background is in marketing strategy. So I started with Ogilvy in Amsterdam, then moved with them to New York, to Chicago, to Singapore, where I had a regional role looking after all of ASEAN for a couple of key clients, and then eventually ended up here in Vietnam. And then I hope my boss isn't watching, my old boss. Then I quit my job. Thanks for moving me here, and thanks for shipping over all my furniture from Singapore.
I won't tell him. It's all right.
That's great. and then I was here in Vietnam, and I was learning so much about Vietnam and the Vietnamese culture, and feeling that it was so entrepreneurial, so young, so interesting. But also learned a lot about what was tough for young Vietnamese in sort of being caught in between kind of two different sides, the very traditional sides where their parents would say, hey, it's Tet, right, which has just passed, and you have to come back to your hometown, and hey, you're 24, why are you not married yet? Where are the kids? Where are the grandkids, right?
Things,
all of
yes.
those. And so when I left Ogilvy, I started my own company, really focused on how can we help people kind of find their own path in life and live how they want to live and do what they want to do. And I did that for a couple of years, and then met Jonah, at that point the CEO of Dreamplex. And I was talking about this whole idea of helping people live their purpose. And he said, well, a lot of that obviously happens through work, right? As you know, for a lot of your young team members, work is a really amazing platform to understand yourself better, to grow and develop both as a person and as a professional.
It's a journey. It is a journey.
It is. And it's a big part of the journey, and we spend a lot of hours at work, most of us, right? Especially as company owners and as founders. So, so we started talking about how can we take that idea into the workplace, and that's how I ended up at Dreamplex. Originally, really focused on product in a role called Chief Experience Officer, which we totally made up, but basically focused on what is it really to come to work, and how do we make that something that's more than just doing the job.
And that leads into my next question. So look, Dreamplex, people may or may not have an idea of where it is, where it's come from, and what it provides the market. We'll come back to that. But looking forward, you've got this journey. You've created a new brand, a new sort of product. And I don't sort of understand fully and I'd love to hear about what it is, because it's an evolution. The Flex OS, it's an evolution of where you're going and where you see work, lifestyle, the people, and what's needed for that journey, for that experience, for that growth. Where are you taking the business? And we'll look more at traditional things, but yeah, most of this is I want to learn. I want to, that journey
Sure.
of where we are going. Where do you see things? What are you trying to achieve?
Yeah, so if you just look at Dreamplex itself, right, it was founded in 2016, and it was probably what people would think about when they think about co-working, right? So it was the first commercial co-working space in Vietnam. It was a really big, colorful space in the heart of District 1 where all of the entrepreneurs at that time and all of the startup founders, very techy, they would all come together, right? And that's where they would meet each other, where they would find potential investors. They did a lot of like hackathons and demo days and those kind of things, but really focused on those small startups, right? And they built a brand around that. So Tin Nguyen, the original founder, made that very famous, especially when Obama happened to come to Vietnam for his trade mission.
That's where he did his thing, yes.
He said, oh, where can I meet all these entrepreneurs? Somehow he ended up at Dreamplex. So, we took a few photos and we sort of like distributed that. So, that worked really well. We then opened a second location. This is all from before I joined under Tin's leadership still. And then when they were about to plan the third location, he said, okay, this cannot just be kind of like part of the overall business that he was running, a real estate business. This has to be something on its own. And so he hired a team, including Jonah, who I mentioned before, to basically be a full-time professional CEO just for Dreamplex business alone. And I think that's where the journey really started, to think about why would people at that point come to Dreamplex, and later why would companies come to Dreamplex. And the more we started getting into that, I think I joined about a year after Jonah joined, the more we started getting into them, the more we realized that what companies really need, and I'm sure in your business you see this a lot as well, is not just office space.
It's people, people, people.
It's all about people, right? So even if we just did a quick tour of your office, right? If you look at how that's designed, that's not just a place for people to come and sit down and do work, right? It's really designed for all the different things that happen within the office, but also, the bigger part, how do people feel like they're connecting to your company culture, right? How do they feel like they have, again, room to grow, both as a person and as a professional? And so that's really what we started focusing on. How can we help companies beyond just office space, which especially at that time, especially in co-working, had become a total commodity.
And that was interesting, which is I was trying to get past that, but it's good you explained it, because co-working is a commodity, and that's the concept of our clients enter the market. I need a co-working space. I want a desk and chair for my staff. And that's that commodity mindset that it's become. Yep. So you're evolving that. Where are you taking that thinking and the people side of things?
Sure, yeah. So this again comes really from my strategy background, right? Looking at sort of like blue ocean, red ocean, right? So you can look at something like co-working, in 2016 when Tin started the business, that was something completely new. You're the first in the market, you can demand really good prices, right? And you can build something very unique. And then of course, over time, when other people see that and also start opening co-working spaces and there's more and more and more demand, then at some point that becomes a total commodity. So and the core of co-working basically then is, you have space and you have desks and chairs, as you said, and someone who needs just a desk and a chair, they come to a co-working space. And again, when we really started looking into it, we saw a much bigger opportunity, which is to how to service companies on what they really need, which again is, how do I build a great culture? How do I build a great team? How do I make those team members feel like they're part of something special and that they get supported in more than just, a space to sit in, but really the employee engagement side and the employee experience side.
And there's so many different parts there that become important, that is not just is irrelevant of what the bricks and mortar sitting around you in many, many ways. What's the biggest challenge for buy-in, trying to get people to sort of accept that that's where we're going? Because some of us understand that's what you need to do, but those people, there will be resistance to that sort of change in thinking of work, of the future. And I personally think this is where we're going. How do you convince people? How do you show people that that retains employees, it helps grow people? This is what's going to make your business better.
Yeah, well, as with everything, when you're kind of pioneering something in the market, it's never super easy or super straightforward. It is kind of a journey that you have to take people on. I do think the market is sort of developing itself a little bit. I think the lockdown last year helped a lot. It was really painful in the moment because it's not really good to be in the real estate industry when you're in a 4 or 5 month lockdown, as you can imagine.
But that educated, it changed us. Work from home is now something that people address as an example, which is just part of vernacular. It's part of what we do. There's elements of that where pre-lockdown, it wasn't normal. It was not accepted. It becomes so culture. It's a major lockdown. Pandemic has made major cultural shifts. I agree.
100%. I think, we've been talking about this for a long time, but just take 1 year back. I mean, there were many companies who said, oh yeah, let's do hybrid work. Let's give people freedom and flexibility. Those were not the most common themes in the business world in Vietnam.
Rare.
Very rare. Flash forward 1 year, it's completely different, right? So we basically have people in companies saying, when I was working from home, that was actually quite good. That actually worked quite well. Surprisingly, maybe, yeah. And so companies also saw that actually maybe it isn't that bad when people work from home, right? Maybe it isn't that bad when, people can sort of take a combination of sometimes in the office, sometimes at home, and sort of, also allowing people the flexibility to, find their best way to work, right? People are typically more productive when they can control their environment.
And where they feel comfortable,
they feel comfortable.
Where that comfort zone, and creating that comfort and creating the flexibility, creating all those things is the environment that we need. And that's not just, here's an office. And the pandemic has opened opportunities. It's opened that flexibility, as you say. It also has created challenges. People are reluctant to commit. They're reluctant to do things. Is that working to your advantage where you can provide that flexibility, or is there a reluctance to sort of what's going to happen next? How are you interacting and trying to, because you've got new properties opening, you've got new experiences opening. Are you dealing with reluctance, or is everyone really, as we said, it's different now and moving forward, where are you seeing things?
I think probably a bit of both. I think there's definitely some reluctance of companies to kind of embrace this new way of working. The good thing is that co-working or flexible office or enterprise co-working, like however we want to call it, it's such a small percentage of the overall kind of real estate market in Vietnam. I think it's like 3 or 4%.
Growing,
growing, but compared to people sitting in traditional offices, it's still relatively small. And so I think we're totally okay not to worry so much about the companies that don't want to go that way, who say owned is more important than shared, or I don't really want to go into this kind of like flexible kind of way of working in the flexible type of office, which I think is totally fine. Again, we're really focused on that 4 to 5%, hopefully, that says, hey, this kind of environment works better for me.
And the advantages, and it fits our culture, and we can grow with that, and we can grow our people, because some people really thrive in that environment. Okay, let's look at pandemic as well again. What other lessons did you learn personally out of the pandemic that you think are relevant now? And we talked about some of this, we've changed our mindset. What else did you learn? Because in our business, we learned that productivity was not necessarily affected short term by flexible workspace. Productivity was not impacted. What was impacted was culture. What was impacted in that, the attachments and learning how to use them. What was the things that you learned out of that, and things that sort of as a better person, but also as a better boss, that you sort of grew out of that process and that you share with your clients, because your clients look to Dreamplex and look to your business for inspiration. You are so very much, you lead them in that in many ways, because you're around them all the time.
Yeah. Not only because we do it for ourselves, but also because both to current customers and future customers, we have a lot of these conversations, typically with a CEO, head of HR, also CFO now more and more. We're having a lot of these conversations about where is work heading, and how can we somehow support you in that. So we typically hear a lot in the market, and therefore we're also able to just have conversations typically with large companies and say, how could you embrace it either within your current existing workplace, or maybe by eventually embracing flexibility. But I would say from the pandemic, from the lockdown especially, I think number one learning was don't have physical papers anymore. Just try to be as digital as possible.
In Vietnam, not so easy to say, not so easy to practice, but yes, I agree with that. Correct?
Right.
Yes.
I emailed you and said, what is Acclime's point of view on digitization, right? Because I do think a lot of the most difficult parts were really about physical paperwork and red stamps and all of that, and trying to courier that between people when everything was shut down. So that was definitely one thing.
And just on that, I have multiple stamps, which the law allows. I've got some at home, some in the office, so it's always stampable. And that is more of a recent, the law's been there, but the need to do that because of our stamps and paperwork, unfortunately. But getting rid of that. And the government is changing a lot of things. It has changed mindset. So I agree that's really important, is paper.
And that whole idea of, everything was already possible, right? But now we're just more forced to do it. I think that's really more what we're talking about, is that none of these things are new. The technology to let people work from home 1 or 2 days a week was always there, right? Really what you're talking about is there now sort of a mindset shift in companies because they've seen that it's not so bad? They've seen the potential upsides?
And it's often, and the reason I asked the question of what you see it from the top. It comes from the top, and you must pass that down.
Yep.
And it's that visionary approach, sort of the chief experience officer into the chief executive officer, using that and sharing that to your team and to your clients.
Right.
Anything else that comes to mind that is that shift that you see?
Well, besides the very practical point about, contracts and all that kind of stuff, right? I think I really agree with your point of view, Matthew, around, the biggest impact was really on company culture, on the sense of connectedness. And as I've seen both in our own very small company, we only have 50 employees, but what I hear from a lot of companies with thousands of employees, the main challenge is you bring new people on board. They never set foot in your office. They never get to see the people they're working with. We all become a bubble on MS Teams or on Slack or on whatever platform people use. And it starts to become less human somehow. And it starts to become a little bit more, I'm just doing work online with, again, like bubbles on a screen. And how can you really connect? How can you really commit to be a part of something? So I've seen a lot of difficulties in onboarding people, in keeping people engaged, in keeping people inspired, and I think Sure.
Yeah. So how do you work around that? Using this is in you're applying these findings in the flexible working space, in the evolution of where Dreamplex is going and the Flex OS what you're doing. How do you achieve that and keep the right balance?
Yeah. So I think two kind of big things that came out of that. The first one is that companies need to be much more intentional, right? I think we use the office kind of as a crutch. And again, when I started at Dreamplex, we all came in 9 to 5 days a week. And of course we said, you're flexible.
Here's your desk.
But I had a desk. I had a desk and I had an office within one of our buildings, right? And we actually, for the first time, really transitioned ourselves to fully hybrid work last year. So very similar to other companies. And I think number one really is that companies have to become much more intentional. All the things that we use the office as a crutch for, that we kind of relied in the office in terms of, are my teams engaged? Are they collaborating? Are they productive? Who is maybe not doing so well? Who is actually doing really well? All of these things, we did that by looking around us in the physical office, right? And so now we have to be much more intentional about, okay, if you cannot rely on being together in an office, because Microsoft research shows that once you give people flexibility, even just 2 days a week working from somewhere besides the office, the chance that two people, even in a team, actually end up seeing each other has shrunk by 60%, because someone may choose Monday, Tuesday, someone else may choose Thursday, Friday. So you have to become so much more intentional.
And that intent as well, because we do find people, certain employees and certain styles of work, they end up working more. They're always home, therefore they're always working.
Right.
And we see them working at strange hours, we see them working and balancing that, because there are certain staff that would, in a business, that would take advantage and be less productive, but some which are more productive, but not in a healthy way. And trying to get that balance and trying to control that, it's an interesting thing that the crutch, the office is not that solution anymore. Yeah. So where are we heading to the future? Is it that real estate footprint is going to become less and less important? Is it shared space? Is it that flexibility to turn a space into whatever you need one day of the week, a different day of the week, something else, and use it in much more flexible? Is it this sort of like a chicken coop, in that everyone go free and work it out for yourself, provided that you're being productive, but we'll give you an area that we think allows productivity, but we're not going to constrain you. Where are we heading, and where does the future lead us, do you think? Look, the visionary side of things.
The visionary. I think the very practical side is that as a lot of people that we've been speaking to over the last couple of months have been telling us, company leaders, again, people in really senior HR positions, or again, also on the finance side, because they typically run the admin side of offices, is that things are just becoming more employee-centric. I think that's really the number one thing that kind of came out of that sort of experiment of working from home, and sort of people now being used to getting some flexibility in terms of where to work, is that for a lot of companies, especially when you're in an industry that's very sort of like competitive in terms of talent, it's going to be extremely difficult to not take a more employee-centric view. And when you take a more employee-centric view and you start to engage with your employees to say, how would you like to work, right? We're not going to give you like 100% freedom and you can do whatever you want.
There's some boundaries.
There have to be some boundaries, but we acknowledge that we have to maybe customize a little bit more for you. So I think the employee centricity will definitely be number one. And then number two will be, how can we become more data-driven, right? So how can we be a little bit less, again, let's just all come into the office and do our work, and a little bit more focused on, how are we actually going to work in the future together? And data has to tell us that story, because again, when you cannot rely on just looking around you in the office, how are people doing, that has to be replaced with something. And so I think therefore data will become more important, and that can then help you make decisions about your physical office, right? So if you measure who is working where and when, and you see what kind of spaces they use, you can then say, this idea that we had when we designed our new office, that this was going to be really great for our team, turns out that kind of space never gets used, whereas other spaces get used way too much, right? Then you can start kind of redesigning. You can be more agile in how you manage your office space.
And that's something that probably people in the past didn't do. They built and said, forget. It's the building. It is what it is versus making it work. So you've got some in your plans. You've got some large spaces, flexible spaces coming up. Is there going to be sort of a strategy if you were, working for you're starting at scratch, a combination of big spaces, small spaces? Is it about having lots of choice, or is there sort of a model, the right model that works, or is there no model? And is it having lots of different things in different areas to suit different objectives? Where does flexible working, sort of the old co-working evolution into a flexible workspace, where does it lead you? Because you're having to make those decisions every day about the business.
Not only do we have those decisions to make every day, Matt, but also we're stuck with them, right? So as you know, right, you sign a pretty big bill when you build a new office, and you kind of have to make a pretty good guess as to what it's going to be for the next 5 to 10 years, right? Because that's the time that you're going to write off that amount.
Absolutely. I know I've done that, yes.
So I think one thing that is a little bit different, even from when we did our last location, which we opened January last year, to the new one that we're building right now, right across the bridge from District 1, called The Campus, which we're doing together with Refico. What we're kind of like doing differently is really focused on more agility and more flexibility, meaning that we focus a little bit less on how are we going to design it now, perfectly built based on what we think right now is going to be really attractive for people, and actually retain a lot more flexibility. So we actually see a lot more spaces that can be very modular, that can be reconfigured throughout the day, that can be actually updated based on, again, if the data tells us that a certain space doesn't get used or another space is always overbooked, we can quickly adjust. So there's a lot less built-in components and a lot more flexibility in terms of movable walls and reconfigurable spaces, much less fixed furniture than some of the locations we've built before. So that's a really big difference. And in terms of the balance between social spaces and maybe meeting spaces and maybe private workspaces, we did a lot of research, which actually we're making available freely for any company who are designing their own office, but just how you've done it in your office. It's really a balance of what are the spaces where I can meet, because again, if you can work from anywhere, you really come to the office to meet, to connect, to collaborate, and then maybe sometimes to do some focused work, because that's still important, especially in Vietnam, where maybe not everyone has a nice home office. And then also, how do I, create some space for people's, again, well-being and their own personal development. So all of those elements come into play in those new locations.
So just to finish up the conversation, there's two elements I want to ask about. Is traditional office space, is that, if you're coming into the market, if you're a new entrant, if you're a startup, if whatever there, to what point do people, should they look at traditional office space, or do you feel that for most businesses it's something that we've focused too much in the past, and it should not be part of the business plan when they're trying to focus on growing a business, entering the market? Is that real estate element that we, as you said, the costs, etc., is that a distraction? And I know
I'm super biased.
You've got bias, but it's an evolution. And we had this discussion before I moved into the current office. We actually had a discussion about that and debate, and there's both sides. Where do you see bricks and mortar being? Is that an anchor? Is that something a distraction, or is it something that is down the path? Look at it, get the business right first. What's your view on that?
Well, as I'm currently setting up a new company, which we can talk about briefly as well, I had to look into that. And I think under 20 people, it's a no-brainer to go into a serviced office, into a flexible office, co-working, whatever we call it.
So that's the first decision point. There's no-brainer below 20. Okay.
The kind of facilities that I think, especially if you're trying to get good talent, what they would expect from the office in terms of some kind of a pantry, some kind of a social space, a couple of phone booths, a big meeting room when you need it. Again, for a company under 20 people, it just wouldn't make sense to build all of that out And especially if you're just starting to commit to a long lease, you don't know if your company is going to be doubling in size, you have to move out within 6 months, right? So under 20 people, to me, no brainer. I think between 20 and 200 people, that's actually our sweet spot for our current business, where we're basically fitting out entire floors for companies. So we do this, for example, for Tiki in Hanoi, for FinOS, which is Allianz Insurance's fintech company. They get their entire floor. It's completely white labeled. No one would know that we run it, but we take for them all of the hassle of running not only the physical workspace, but everything that comes with it in terms of attracting, engaging, and retaining talent. We do it for them.
And that's a big plus, that you don't, the infrastructure required to support there is taken off their hand. That's the distraction side of thing that often, that real estate creates distraction, but not just the real estate, it's having to have space. Right. You've got to manage that, people, yes, admin, all of those elements to it. Okay.
And you're going to manage it over time. And so, and then you have the HR side, and you have a lot of things that, again, you have to look at a company, right? Company's core business typically isn't managing real estate or designing beautiful offices or keeping those offices really lively and engaging, right? We redecorate every single location every month, right? We have 2 to 3 events every single week, right? And so those are the things that make that environment really lively, that makes people feel, I'm actually excited to come to the office. And going back to what we talked about before, if people can work from anywhere, the main question companies are trying to answer, and that goes way beyond our sweet spot of 20 to 200 people, the main question that they're trying to answer is, why would people come to the office, right?
So I'm going to touch back on that in a moment. Just to sort of go beyond that, beyond 200, there is still a space for that within the flex. And in my opinion, so my observations, it's actually, I think that's the biggest growing market, because that's, if you've only got 50% of your staff in the office at all time, you don't need a desk. It's a waste of money, and how to get them in there. And you've got so many different needs that you might need to keep changing constantly. So is that a growth area that you see, or is that sort of pretty much consistent with the whole market and your sweet spot of 20 to 200?
So I would say it depends a bit on the type of company. The companies over 200 that are still looking into this kind of model are typically the companies that, again, want to grow really fast, have no sort of like clear prediction in terms of how fast that growth is going to be, and therefore cannot commit to a typical kind of real estate deal. They cannot rent a floor, build out an office, and then see what happens. But I would say most companies over 200 people, they're large enough to start building some of the capabilities that we do as a shared service for a company under 200 people. They're typically able to build that in-house. So that would be a really good facilities function, a good engagement function, maybe some design elements. They can typically build it in-house. So really what we've done, and we're actually, as I mentioned before, and you mentioned the name FlexOS a few times. So just to kind of go back to that, basically, we're setting up a new company, which is going to focus primarily on Singapore and a couple of other ASEAN markets, where we take all those learnings from running workspaces for all of these companies here in Vietnam and really making it into a platform. So we've basically built a technology platform that allows companies to manage any kind of office as a hybrid office. As the future of traditional offices, I think, becomes a bit more like a co-working space.
And that moves from a real estate to a people-centric without having all the resources to manage. Right. Okay.
So if you're, let's say, a company, so for those, for that company, we typically target from 500 employees and up. And so some of the companies we're talking to right now, they're in the thousands of employees, right? A couple of issues you're going to run into. So you have a beautiful office, you're managing that yourself. Definitely you don't have to go into co-working. A couple of issues you're going to run into when you transition from traditional office to hybrid office, right? The first one is that you have to somehow manage the space, right? So you don't really know if you have everyone sitting at a desk right now, then you're moving to anyone can use any desk, right? You somehow need to balance that. So that's really number one. Number two is that there may be certain features in that office, like the space we're sitting in right now, your big boardroom, some of the client zones that actually are in hot demand when you move towards hybrid work. Because now when people come to the office, they typically don't come to the office just to sit at their desk. They're coming to have collaboration sessions, to meet people, to receive guests, right? So some of those facilities become really popular. And so the company needs to make them some of bookable, right? So actually, can someone say,
it's the whole management process. The back end behind that is significant to make that work with large numbers of employees. So it's not easy for that 500 plus staff.
It's definitely not easy. And again, this is not core to what companies typically do. We know this from our co-working background, because there you have to share assets between different companies. So you cannot just leave it to a sign-up sheet that hangs on a meeting room or a Google Calendar or something like that.
It's not just one floor or one building. It's multiple locations and multiple
That's right.
assets. It's really,
That's
there's a
right.
matrix that's hard to manage.
So that's a big challenge. And then I think, the third thing that companies run into is really generally the transition to hybrid work. This is, again, something completely new to companies, right? So when you're making that transition, that means you have a lot of change management to do. You have to, even if the leadership is completely on board, you have to get your middle management on board. You have to get, again, leadership to start showing the right behaviors, to model the right behaviors. And so switching to this way of working that is completely new, there has to be almost like kind of a contract between the employer and the employee in terms of how will we work together in this new future? What can I expect from you, for example, on those 2 days that I'm giving you the flexibility to work from anywhere? For example, you want to work from home. How quickly do you reply to an email? How quickly do you reply to, let's say, an MS Teams message or a Slack message, right? So we've built basically tools to help companies manage that and to really basically bring all of their employees onto a platform. We basically now allow their employees to schedule out their work week. So they may get an email or a message on one of the messaging tools that says, where are you going to be working when this week? They fill out their schedule. Now their team knows what they can expect. Their boss knows what to expect.
And how to contact them and all of that.
Exactly. And for the first time, companies, again, going back to this point of data, for the first time, companies start getting some visibility into where people are working and how they're working. And again, that was never available before now. So that's really the first part that the platform does. The second part, again, is about booking. So managing those facilities, making sure that not 5 people show up on the same day saying, I need the big boardroom, if you just have one to share, right? You definitely don't want to run into that. And then the third piece, really going back to this big transition that companies are making, sort of the unease that a lot of managers have to have people work flexibly, to sort of, again, get insights, get data into, when are people actually showing up? Which teams are doing really well when it comes to adhering to our hybrid policy, our new agreement? Which teams are not doing so well? Which individuals are not doing so well? And basically being able to manage on that. And that can be linked to, for example, check-ins. So we can, if people come and show up to the office, we can check them in. So people know, the manager knows when people actually show up. So there's planning and then there's the reality. It also means if you've booked, for example, a meeting room and you don't show up, that meeting room goes back onto the marketplace, basically, so people can book it again.
And it's the best of both worlds, trying to sort of cross it over and obviously grow your business and grow the opportunities, but it makes sense. Just to finish up here in the essence of time, we've been talking for quite a while. I'll come back to a question I sort of stopped you before about that office, that interaction, and what Dreamplex and trying to interact, and you said you constantly change. What... post-pandemic, there's less ability face-to-face meetings, events, functions. It's a lot more controlled. That was a key part about Dreamplex, was the fact there was always things happening. There's always ability to collaborate and learn. You didn't have to be involved, but there was an opportunity there. Look back at some of your competitors years ago. It was free beer. It was, there was all these things. What are you doing now, which is interactive, which is unique, which enables people to feel connected and want to be there? What's some of the things that you've evolved, unique things, now that we have to change the approach? I'm just interested for the reality of now. Where are we at? What's the now when it comes to
now,
sort of within Dreamplex itself?
Yeah, and especially again going back to that idea of, when you give people more flexibility, right? Even if people are in the office, doesn't mean everyone is there. But you still want it to be an inclusive environment. You still want people to all have the same opportunity. So it's number one, it's a lot more online. So doing things where, for example, creative workshops, we would go and, bring someone in who does, painting a canvas or making your own perfume. We would literally, book out an event space in a location and we would say, hey, Tuesday at 2 p.m., you can do this workshop. And now there's a lot more where we ship kits to people's at home. And you basically have the teacher online at a certain time, everyone comes together. It still feels like a community event. It still feels like an opportunity to connect with your coworkers, or in this case, also with other people in the community. But you can do it from anywhere. So that is a big transition, even for something like
So it's that community focus, and I think mentioned that word right at the start, and we'll probably a good word to finish on. That community focus is still the core part of making sure it works in essence.
Yeah, and it just takes, again, more intentionality. It takes more of a employee-centric focus. A really big part of why we originally developed this platform internally and now are selling it to companies to manage their own office spaces and their own workforces is that we knew it was really difficult to develop programming or to develop events and activities that would really fit with what people actually like to do. And you mentioned the free beer or happy hour. There may be 10 or 20% in a company that are really extroverted, that at the end of a work week want to linger, want to stay around, want to drink a beer. But most people in Vietnam just want to go home on Friday afternoon. But they love a meditation break in the middle of the week, or they love to do something creative, or they love to connect with people, but in a very themed session. So that's why we started developing this platform, because we realized we can only organize really great activities that actually resonate with employees. And this is what every single large company is facing. How do I organize activities and engagement that actually fits with what people are interested in if we have the data? So we need to get to know every employee on an individual level. And this applies to the engagement side, but it also applies to the office side. It also applies generally how we work together. We need to get to know people on an individual basis. And then when we build up really rich profiles of those employees, we can sort of zoom out and see, within my company of, let's say, 1,000 people, there are 200 people who are really interested in this. Let's organize something for them. There are 400 people who are really into running. Let's do something for them. And then you can put together that sort of like program of engagement activities that is really exciting for everyone to engage in. And that is something that I think is going to be one of the biggest shifts. How do we become more data-centric and use that to become more employee-centric?
And it fits in, just as we finished, fits into something I read a while ago, which was offices and companies shouldn't look at themselves as a family, should look at themselves as a community, and need to create the community and create the elements that a community needs to be successful, which is exactly what you've just talked about.
There's a beautiful thing in Web3, which is the real future, obviously, where they say that new startups in that space, they don't need to have a minimal viable product, an MVP. They need to have a minimum viable community, MVC. And that idea of companies are just a group of people, and the more that people feel connected and the more they feel like I belong here, the longer they will stick around, the more productive they will be, the better teammate they will be. And I think that's where companies are really going to focus. How in this distributed world, in this hybrid world, can I still connect people back to my company, back to their teams, back to their managers? I think that's going to be really the main focus.
Fantastic. Daan, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you everyone for watching this episode of Acclime Conversations, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Thank you.